It was a quiet evening, one of those nights when you decide to do something different just to break the routine. My friend Luca and I had decided to go bowling after work. There weren't many people, just a few groups of friends and a couple of families. The background music, the sound of bowling balls, and laughter created a relaxed atmosphere. We were on our fifth game when a man approached us. He looked disheveled, wearing a worn leather jacket and sporting a look that didn't bode well. He asked me for a cigarette. I don't smoke, so I told him no. He stood there for a moment, staring at me with cold eyes. Then, without saying a word, he turned and walked away. But not completely. He sat at a nearby table, keeping his eyes fixed on us. I tried to ignore him and return to our game. Luca was up to bowl. I watched him prepare when I noticed the man had moved closer again, this time standing behind me. His gaze made me uncomfortable, but I tried not to let it show. Luca was concentrating on his ball, but I noticed a change in his expression. Luca's eyes had become more alert, almost worried. Then everything happened in an instant. As soon as Luca released the ball, he turned sharply and lunged at the man behind me, striking him with surprising force. I heard a muffled scream and the sound of objects falling. The lights, which had been dim until that moment, all turned on at once, illuminating the scene with harsh clarity. The man was on the ground, and next to him was a gun. Luca stood over him, his face contorted in a mixture of anger and fear. I couldn't understand what was happening. I felt paralyzed, unable to move or speak. The people around us had stopped, staring at the scene with astonished looks. The bowling staff rushed over, and someone called the police. While we waited, Luca slowly stood up, looking at me with eyes I will never forget. "He saved your life," said an elderly woman who had come over. That man was about to pull out the gun. The woman's words hit me like a punch. The reality of what had just happened began to sink into my mind. If Luca hadn't intervened, if he hadn't reacted so quickly. The police arrived a few minutes later. They questioned everyone, took the gun, and arrested the man who had come to and was shouting insults at anyone in sight. Luca explained what had happened. He had seen the man approaching me with a menacing look and had noticed the gun in his jacket pocket. He had acted on instinct. When it was all over, the bowling alley slowly returned to normal. But for Luca and me, nothing would ever be the same again. That night, as we drove home, the silence was oppressive. The street was deserted, and the streetlights cast long, unsettling shadows. I could still feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins, my heart pounding wildly. Days passed before I could sleep peacefully. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man, heard the sound of the gun hitting the ground. I thought about how fragile our safety is, how everything can change in an instant. But I also thought about Luca, his quick thinking and courage. We only told our story to a few close friends. We didn't want to draw attention to ourselves. We just wanted to put it all behind us. But every time I passed that bowling alley, the memory of that night came back vividly. And every time I saw Luca, I felt a mix of gratitude and fear. I don't know who that man was or what drove him to do what he did, but I know that, thanks to Luca, I'm still alive. And every day I remember how lucky I am to have a friend like him. Life has returned to normal, but with an added awareness. The awareness that danger can be anywhere, even in a seemingly safe place like a bowling alley. And that sometimes heroes don't wear capes, they simply do the right thing at the right time. It was one of those evenings when I needed some time to myself. After a long week at work, I decided to go bowling, an activity I found surprisingly relaxing. The Starlight Bowling Alley was a 15-minute walk from my house, and I often found myself there, throwing a few balls in solitude, enjoying the steady, comforting rhythm of the game. That night, the place was almost empty, with just a few scattered customers and the usual staff. The atmosphere was calm, the lights dimmed, and the sound of balls hitting pins created a sort of soundtrack that helped me detach from daily problems. After finishing my game, I took a few minutes to enjoy one last beer, absent-mindedly watching the empty lanes. When I decided it was time to leave, I waved goodbye to the owner behind the counter, a kind man I always exchanged a few words with. His dog, an old German shepherd named Max, wagged his tail at me. He knew all the regular customers by now and often roamed around the place. As I stepped out of the bowling alley, the cold night air hit me, making me pull my coat tighter around my body. I started walking home, thinking about how pleasant that short walk was. The streets were nearly deserted, and the silence was broken only by the sound of my footsteps on the pavement. I approached the alley behind the bowling alley, a route I usually avoided, but that night seemed shorter and less tiring. As soon as I entered, though, a sense of unease began to creep in. The alley was dark and narrow, with long, threatening shadows cast by the few working streetlights. Suddenly, I heard movement behind me. Before I could react, a hand grabbed me, and I felt the cold blade of a knife pressed against my neck. My heart started pounding wildly. My breath became irregular. The raspy, menacing voice of the man ordered me to hand over my wallet. I couldn't move. Terror paralyzed me. In that moment of panic, I heard a familiar sound, a low, deep growl. Max. The bowling alley owner's dog was there, just a few meters away from me. The growl grew louder, and I could see his eyes gleaming in the darkness. The assailant seemed to hesitate. His grip on my neck loosened slightly. Then, in an instant, everything happened very quickly. Max's growl turned into a fierce bark, and the man behind me jumped back, startled. I turned just in time to see Max lunge at him. My attacker, panicked, dropped the knife and ran off, disappearing into the dark alley. Max stopped beside me, continuing to growl at the retreating shadow. The owner of the bowling alley appeared shortly after, alarmed by the dog's barking. He had opened the back door to take out the trash and had seen everything. He rushed over, his face pale and worried. For a moment, I stood there, trying to catch my breath and calm down. My heart was still racing furiously, but I felt a wave of relief and gratitude for that brave dog. Max had saved my life. The owner escorted me back into the bowling alley, offering me a glass of water and a seat. He asked what had happened, and as I recounted the events, the horror of the situation began to fade, replaced by a sense of disbelief and gratitude. The police arrived shortly after, called by the owner. I told them my story, describing the man and what had happened. They took the knife as evidence, but my attacker had already vanished into the night. In the following days, I returned to the bowling alley several times, not just to bowl, but also to thank Max. Every time I saw him, I felt a special bond with that dog who had acted without hesitation to protect me. I never believed in ghost stories. I was the kind of person who laughed at those tales told around the campfire, convinced they were just made-up stories to scare kids. But everything changed one winter night a few years ago at the old bowling alley on the highway. I had just gone through a tough breakup, and my friends decided to drag me out to take my mind off things. Bowling seemed like a good idea. It was a familiar place with cheap beer and a cozy atmosphere. However, the place had a story. It was said to be haunted, but no one took those rumors seriously. That night, the place was almost empty. It was just us and the staff. It was an old bowling alley with creaky wooden lanes, neon lights, and a jukebox playing old rock hits. The air was thick with the smell of popcorn and stale beer. We had been playing for about an hour when the first strange thing happened. I was about to throw when the light on my lane suddenly went out. The other lanes were still lit, but mine was in total darkness. We called the manager, who came over to check it out. He muttered something about old wiring, gave the control panel a tap, and the light came back on. Nothing to worry about, he told us. But that little incident had created a strange atmosphere. There was a tension in the air that I couldn't explain. We continued playing, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't leave me. And then something happened that I still can't explain. I was about to throw again when I heard a whisper behind me. I turned around, but there was no one there. "Did you hear that?" I asked my friends. They gave me strange looks and shook their heads. I thought I had imagined it all, but it wasn't just my imagination. As the night went on, things started getting stranger. We smelled a weird sulfur odor that grew stronger and stronger. Then we saw the figure. We were sitting at one of the tables beside the lanes when we noticed a shadow moving along the wall at the far end of the room. It was a human figure, tall and dark. It seemed to be watching the lanes, moving slowly. I felt a chill down my spine. I couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. We moved closer to get a better look, but there was no one there. Just dancing shadows and the distant sound of a bowling ball hitting pins. The jukebox started playing on its own, an old song I didn't recognize, and the light on our lane started flickering again. Then, the manager returned. "You need to leave," he said, in a voice that brooked no argument. "We're closing early tonight." He seemed nervous, almost scared. We got up without protesting, quickly gathering our things. As we left, I looked back and saw that figure again, standing in the middle of the lane, motionless, as if it were watching us. We paid and stepped out into the cold night air. As we walked away, I asked the manager what was going on. He hesitated, then said, "You're not the first to see strange things here. This bowling alley was built on an old cemetery. Things started happening years ago, but nothing serious, just disturbing." My friends tried to forget about it, joking about how easily we got spooked, but I knew there was more to it. A couple of months later, I heard that the owner of the bowling alley had called in ghost hunters to investigate what was going on inside the place. They found a lot of strange and inexplicable phenomena. The bowling alley is now closed. Rumor had it that there were too many strange incidents, too many frightened people. They demolished the place, trying to build a new shopping center. But I always thought that whatever was in there wouldn't be so easy to get rid of, because I know that sometimes the scariest stories are the ones you can't explain. My name is Tom, and I live in Boston. Last fall, my Uncle Jack took me to the movies to see an Eli Roth horror film called Cabin Fever. I was excited to spend time with him, a man who was always cheerful and loved horror stories just like me. I never imagined how that movie would awaken ghosts from his past. Everything seemed to be going well. The movie was terrifying and engrossing, as one would expect from Roth. Then came the campfire story scene. One of these stories was about a bowling alley, the Brighton Bowl, where a former employee went insane and committed horrible acts. I immediately noticed that something changed in my uncle's expression. His eyes lost their usual light and became dark. He didn't say anything, but his silence was deafening. The next day, I found my uncle sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee in his hands. He seemed lost in thought. I sat down next to him, not knowing what to say. After a few minutes, he started talking, his voice low and trembling. "My dear Tom," he began, "there's something I've never told you." I looked up, curious and worried at the same time. When I was younger, I often went to a place called Sammy White's Brighton Bowl. It was owned by a former Red Sox catcher. My heart started beating faster. He was about to share something dark, I was sure of it. "It was a great place," he continued. "I used to go there almost every day after work. One day I showed up and found the place closed, police tape everywhere. I didn't understand what had happened until I heard the news on TV." He stared at me, his eyes filled with painful memories. "A former employee had gone mad. He tied up 4 people, beat them with a bowling pin, and then killed them with a firearm. And all for just $4,000. He did it because he couldn't get his job back." I was breathless. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My uncle was there on September 22nd, 1980. He had left before everything happened. He told me he never read the details. He found them too disturbing. But watching that movie, it felt so real to him, like it had happened to him. That incident happened on the same day someone I cared about was there. What if he had been there later? Who knows what could have happened? I have never looked at that movie the same way again.